You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In 1954, the Geneva Conference aimed to resolve issues left over after the France versus Viet Minh conflict ended, marking the conclusion of the First Indochina War. Notably, neither the United States nor the state of Vietnam signed any of the agreements at this conference. The agreements that were signed established a ceasefire line dividing Vietnam into a southern part, governed by the state of Vietnam, and a northern part controlled by the Viet Minh. They outlined plans for a general election by July 1956 to reunify Vietnam and allowed for a 300-day period during which people could move freely between the North and South. Additionally, the accords prohibited any foreign political interference, the creation of new governments without elections, and the presence of foreign military forces. By 1961, South Vietnam's President Ngo Dinh Diem was facing growing dissatisfaction from various groups, including Buddhists who opposed his Catholic-dominated administration. The government suppressed Viet Minh activities that were part of their campaign for the promised elections, leading to a renewed push for insurgency by the North Vietnamese leadership at the end of 1956. The struggle against Diem's regime intensified with the support of the North, culminating in a significant infiltration of communist soldiers into the South by 1963. During the early 1960s, the U.S. was backing South Vietnam with military advisors under President John F. Kennedy, who had begun to doubt the effectiveness of the Saigon government. Following Kennedy's assassination, President Johnson amplified U.S. military involvement, influenced by containment strategies aimed at preventing Southeast Asian countries from falling to communism. Operation Plan 34 Alpha was a top-secret initiative started by the CIA in 1961 and later overseen by the Defense Department, involving covert attacks against North Vietnam, using fast patrol boats secretly acquired from Norway. Although these operations were meant to be discreet, with South Vietnamese crews executing them under direct approval from U.S. commanders, Hanoi eventually protested to the International Control Commission, which oversaw the Geneva Accords implementation, though the U.S. initially denied involvement. It wasn't until 4 years later that Secretary McNamara acknowledged to Congress the U.S.'s cooperation in the attacks. Parallel to these covert operations, the U.S. Navy initiated an intelligence collection program named DeSoto, focusing on gathering electronic warfare intelligence. This program operated independently, but was mindful to avoid overlap with Operation Plan 34 Alpha's areas of operation. A significant escalation occurred in 1964, with covert attacks on North Vietnamese islands and border outposts, suggesting a synchronized effort to increase military pressures on North Vietnam, as inferred by the North Vietnamese government. Daniel Ellsberg, who was working at the Pentagon on the night of August 4th, reported on the activities of USS Maddox, which was on a surveillance mission known as a DeSoto mission, close to the territorial waters of northern Vietnam. On July 31, 1964, the Maddox embarked on this mission in the Gulf of Tonkin, with Captain George Stephen Morrison commanding the local American naval forces from his flagship, the USS Bon Homme Richard. The Maddox was instructed to stay at least 8 miles away from the coast of North Vietnam and 4 miles from Hon Nhu Island. Interestingly, when South Vietnamese commandos raided Hon Nhu, the Maddox was 120 miles away from the targeted area. By July 1964, tensions were high off the coast of North Vietnam due to South Vietnamese commando attacks and the responses from the North Vietnamese military. A significant incident occurred on the night of July 30, 1964, when South Vietnamese forces attacked a North Vietnamese radar station on Hon Mae Island. According to historian Han Yok, these attacks, especially the one on Hon Mae Island, combined with the proximity of the Maddox, triggered the ensuing confrontation, despite the Maddox not being involved in these commando raids. Following this, the Maddox started patrolling near the North Vietnamese coast, even getting within a few miles of Hon Mae Island, while the USS Ticonderoga, an aircraft carrier, was also positioned close by. By August 1st, the North Vietnamese had taken notice of the Maddox and were preparing to confront it. The Maddox withdrew but returned to its patrol route on August 2nd, followed by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats capable of speeds much faster than the Maddox. These boats, commanded by brothers Van Bot, Van Tu, and Van Gian, and part of Squadron 135 under Le Duy Quai, moved to attack, The Maddox responded by changing its course, speeding up, and firing warning shots. When the North Vietnamese boats engaged, Maddox reported being under attack while in international waters far from the coast. In response to the torpedo boat's assault, the Maddox returned fire, managing to evade torpedoes and damaging one of the attacking boats. American jets from the USS Ticonderoga also engaged, striking the North Vietnamese boats. The Maddox sustained minor damage but was able to withdraw to safer waters alongside the USS Turner Joy. A 2005 internal National Security Agency historical study shed new light on these events, stating that earlier on August 2nd, the Maddox had fired warning shots at the North Vietnamese boats without provocation, contrary to claims by the Johnson administration that the Vietnamese had fired first. Furthermore, the Maddox had actually been closer to Han Mai Island than previously acknowledged, challenging the North Vietnamese territorial claims. Following this encounter, President Johnson ordered further patrols into North Vietnamese waters, mistakenly perceived by North Vietnam as coordinated attacks due to their timing with South Vietnamese raids. Admiral Sharp insisted that the U.S. did not provoke the encounter on August 2nd, arguing that the North Vietnamese had tracked the Maddox and were aware it wasn't directly attacking North Vietnam. He also claimed that Maddox's operations in international waters were consistent with international norms and similar missions previously conducted. However, discrepancies in territorial water claims between the U.S. and North Vietnam, and later statements by a North Vietnamese general, highlight the complexity and controversy surrounding the incident. On August 4th, following a previous incident, the ships Maddox and Turner Joy headed out for another patrol close to North Vietnam's coast. Their mission was symbolic, to demonstrate United States presence, with instructions to keep at least 11 miles away from the coast. That evening, amid stormy weather, the destroyers picked up what they believed were signals of an imminent attack by North Vietnamese forces, based on radar, sonar, and radio readings. For about 2 hours, from around 9:40 p.m. to 11:35 p.m. local time, they responded by firing at what they thought were targets and took evasive maneuvers, despite there being no concrete evidence of enemy boats, such as wreckage or casualties, found later. In the early hours that followed, at 1:27 a.m. local time, the commanding officer, Captain Herrick, sent a message questioning the reality of the attack. He suggested that the odd radar readings might have been caused by the poor weather and possibly too eager crew members, mentioning that they hadn't actually seen any enemy boats with their own eyes. He recommended a full review before taking any further action. An hour after his first message, Herrick communicated again, expressing his uncertainty about the entire situation and advising a detailed reconnaissance by air in daylight. Later, seeking to clarify the events, Herrick pointed out the conflicting details, but affirmed that the very first encounter seemed genuine. Notably, he theorized that a torpedo had been launched at the Maddox, which was heard but not seen, and raised doubts about the accuracy of subsequent reports, suggesting they might have confused the ship's own sounds for enemy torpedoes. Despite Herrick's growing doubts and recommendations for a careful investigation, it's believed that Defense Secretary McNamara didn't share these concerns with President Johnson or Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, Jr. As the day unfolded without clear evidence, the Johnson administration leaned on interpreting intercepted communications as plans for another attack by North Vietnam. These communications were later understood to be related to the recovery efforts of damaged boats from the August 2nd incident and observations of the United States actions, not evidence of an active attack. On the evening of August 4th, President Johnson made an urgent nationwide television announcement. He detailed an attack by North Vietnamese ships on 2 United States Navy vessels, the Maddox and the Turner Joy, and asked for permission to respond militarily. Johnson framed the incident as an unprovoked aggression by North Vietnam, placing the United States in a defensive position, and he emphasized the attacks happened in international waters. He assured the American public and South Vietnam of his commitment to their security and stated there was no desire for war. Despite the public messaging of seeking peace, Johnson had already decided on a military response, codenamed Operation Pierce Arrow, within minutes of the incident. He even communicated with the Soviet Union to clarify he wasn't seeking to escalate the conflict. Shortly after his announcement, United States aircraft targeted North Vietnamese facilities in retaliation. In Congress, Senator Wayne Morse tried to raise questions about the accuracy of the records concerning the Maddox incident before the resolution was presented. based on tips from an anonymous informant. His efforts to encourage Congress to scrutinize Johnson's resolution further didn't immediately succeed. However, Morse persistently opposed the resolution, arguing that the United States' actions constituted acts of war rather than defense. Initially, he struggled to find support, in part because he didn't disclose his sources and lacked substantial evidence. Over time, as the United States deepened its involvement in Vietnam, Morse's arguments began to resonate more within the government. On the evening of August 4th, the United States was still searching for solid evidence when President Johnson made his public address about the Tonkin Gulf incident. Records from that day show that both President Johnson and his Defense Secretary McNamara were not sure an attack had actually taken place. In August, major magazines like Time, Life, and Newsweek carried stories on the incident. Time magazine vividly described the event, saying intruders swiftly moved through the darkness, opening fire on U.S. destroyers from close range. It conveyed a sense of certainty from Admiral Sharp that the United States would respond to this act. According to these reports, there was a unified stance within the administration about the incident. These events also came at a time when the United States was threatening North Vietnam, and American politicians were advocating for an escalation of the war. On May 4, 1964, William Bundy had already voiced a robust stance, suggesting the United States should push the communists out of South Vietnam, even if it meant confronting North Vietnam and China. Despite these aggressive positions, the Johnson administration spent the latter half of 1964 persuading the American public that war with North Vietnam was not on the horizon. North Vietnam's General Giap, along with various officials and crew members of the Maddox, suggested that the United States was trying to provoke North Vietnam to justify escalating the conflict. U.S. Undersecretary George Ball later reflected that many were seeking a reason to start bombing. He noted the provocative nature of the destroyer's mission in the Gulf of Tonkin. Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst, revealed that top U.S. officials, including President Johnson, were well aware that the evidence for the attack on August 4, 1964, was questionable at best. Despite doubts, there was eagerness to expand the conflict in Vietnam, with increased covert operations along the North Vietnamese coast. The destroyer Maddox, equipped for electronic espionage, was part of this strategy, authorized to approach the North Vietnamese coast closely, collecting intelligence that might provoke a response. James Bamford, a former Navy intelligence analyst, explained in his book Body of Secrets that the Maddox's primary role was to provoke North Vietnam by sailing close to its shores, especially during commando raids, making it seem like the Maddox was coordinating those attacks. This timing and proximity gave North Vietnam every reason to perceive the Maddox as a threat. John McNaughton and William Bundy in 1964 were already suggesting steps to provoke North Vietnam into military action, including more aggressive patrol missions. This context demonstrates a series of calculated moves by the United States to escalate its involvement in Vietnam, under the pretext of defending against supposed aggressions. On the afternoon of August 4, Washington time, Herrick reported to the Commander-in-Chief Pacific in Honolulu. He mentioned that unusual weather patterns were interfering with the ship's radar, making it unclear whether an attack had actually occurred. In fact, by 1:27 p.m. Washington time, Herrick sent out a message stating they hadn't actually seen any North Vietnamese patrol boats and suggested taking a step back to fully evaluate the situation before making any further moves. McNamara, after returning to the Pentagon that afternoon, did see Herrick's message. However, he didn't rush to inform President Johnson that the basis for his decision made over lunch to proceed with retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam was now quite uncertain. Up until this point, Johnson had resisted suggestions from McNamara and other advisors to start bombing North Vietnam, despite having become president. While the Maddox was involved in intelligence support for South Vietnamese attacks, Johnson insisted in his congressional testimony that the U.S. Navy was not assisting the South Vietnamese military activities in the Gulf. He described the incident as unprovoked because the ship was in international waters at the time. As a result, on August 7th, Congress passed a resolution known as the Southeast Asia Resolution. This granted Johnson the power to carry out military actions in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. Essentially, this resolution allowed Johnson to do whatever was deemed necessary, including the use of military force, to help any country or state part of the Southeast Asia Collective Defense Treaty in defending its freedom. The Gulf of Tonkin incident also left an impression on China. It strengthened the belief among Chinese Communist Party leaders that the United States might one day invade China. This fear spurred greater support for Mao Zedong's Third Front campaign, aimed at enhancing heavy and defense industry in the more secure inner regions of China, preparing for the possibility of a foreign invasion. In a candid moment, President Johnson once remarked, "For all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there." This skepticism toward the events in the Gulf of Tonkin wasn't isolated. John White, a former naval officer, publicly challenged the official account in a 1967 letter to the New Haven, Connecticut Register. He accused President Johnson, Secretary McNamara, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff of misleading Congress about supposed attacks on U.S. destroyers. White's efforts to expose the truth didn't stop there. He also participated in the 1968 documentary In the Year of the Pig. Decades later, in 1981, Captain Herrick, accompanied by journalist Robert Scheer, revisited the ship's records and found no evidence to support the initial reports of a torpedo attack on August 4th, an event Herrick had once believed in. This discovery aligned with later findings that confirmed no North Vietnamese attacks took place that night, challenging the narrative accepted by U.S. officials and the Maddox's crew at the time. Their believed attack led to a swift military response called Operation Pierce Arrow, targeting North Vietnamese naval installations. Squadron Commander James Stockdale, who flew above the scene during the so-called Second Attack, shared in his 1984 book Love and War that he saw no enemy boats, only American firepower aimed at empty waters. Stockdale, ordered to remain silent about his observations, felt burdened by his secret, especially during his later capture by the enemy. Adding to the doubt, retired Vietnamese Defense Minister Vo Nguyen Giap denied any Vietnamese attack on August 4th during a 1995 meeting with McNamara, but acknowledged an encounter on August 2nd. Furthermore, a 2001 released tape of McNamara revealed his doubts to Johnson about the attack's occurrence right after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed. Eugene Poteet, a retired senior CIA engineering executive, reflected in 1999 on his tasked investigation in 1964 to verify the attack reports. He concluded that no attack had occurred, suggesting the White House was more interested in justifying military action than in the truth. On the 50th anniversary of the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 2014, John White published The Gulf of Tonkin Events, 50 years later, a footnote to the history of the Vietnam War. In it, he recounted his role in questioning the official narrative and the distinction between lies told by omission and commission, accusing Johnson of the former. This book and White's letter emphasized the importance of truth in the discourse surrounding the Vietnam War's inception, a theme echoed in his feature in the August 2014 issue of Connecticut Magazine. Back in October 2005, the New York Times shed light on a discovery by Robert J. Hanyok, a historian at the National Security Agency. Hanyok found out that the National Security Agency had presented distorted intelligence about the August 4th incident to policymakers, making it seem like an attack had definitely happened. This revelation first made its rounds in the Cryptologic Quarterly Journal back in the winter of 2000 and spring of 2001, a whole 5 years before the Times caught on to the story. Intelligence officials mentioned how there was some resistance to making Hanyok's findings public out of fear. They might draw parallels with the justifications for the Iraq War that started in 2003. Digging through National Security Agency archives, Hanyok unearthed that the confusion started at Phu Bai Combat Base, where analysts wrongly assumed destroyers were about to be attacked. This mistaken belief, along with supporting evidence that actually didn't support the conclusion, was sent back to the National Security Agency. Hanyok pointed out that those at the National Security Agency likely listened to analysts on the ground, out of respect for their proximity to the situation. As more intelligence came in that night, it failed to back the supposed ambush, yet National Security Agency officials, already convinced an attack was imminent, ignored the majority of signals intelligence that contradicted their narrative. This skewed version of events was what ended up being reported to the president. On November 30, 2005, the National Security Agency began releasing classified materials about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, including Hanyok's analysis, although in a toned-down version. He noted that the intelligence was presented to the Johnson administration in a way that blocked any balanced or comprehensive assessment of the events. Essentially, they were only fed bits that supported the narrative of a communist attack on the destroyers. Hanyok believed a key reason for this distortion was President Johnson's intolerance for uncertainty, which would have weakened his standing. Ray Klein is quoted as understanding the information from the Seventh Fleet was unreliable, yet they were tasked with delivering only the facts without further discussion on the evidence's reliability. This was largely because everyone was aware of how Johnson disliked uncertainties. Hanyok's extensive study on the Tonkin Gulf incident was part of a broader historical investigation into National Security Agency and American signals intelligence activities during the Indochina Wars. This comprehensive history saw a somewhat edited release by the National Security Agency in January 2008, published by the Federation of American Scientists. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.